Good morning. Thanks for joining the Kehillah Chari Torah Halacha Review for Tuesday, January 19th. We're talking about various aspects and concerns to do with salt in Jewish law, in halacha and custom. On Rosh Hashanah, the custom is to dip challah in honey, right, to symbolize a sweet new year. The poskim say that the challah should be dipped into salt and then into honey. Some dip one side of the slice in salt and the other side into honey. Others do not use salt at all. Brings a number of later achronim here, a contemporary 20th century poskim, and I have seen one other custom, which is to dip in honey for hamotzi, and then later on at some point during the meal to take a little piece of challah and dip that in the salt. So you have yet another possibility, another combination. What about having separate salt shakers for meat and dairy when it's on the table? So the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserli, is writing for the Ashkenazic world, says the minhag, the custom, is to have two separate salt utensils for meat and dairy in order to avoid inadvertently mixing milk and meat, food particles. The poskim say this halacha applies only when the salt is placed in open utensils. If you have a little salt dish, a salt cellar, I think it's called, that's when we're talking about, right? Because you'll take a little bit of challah, you'll dip it in that, and maybe it'll have some food on it. So only when it's open utensils. If you a salt shaker, the salt never comes in contact with food and then goes back into the container. It's shaken out of the shaker. That's the definition of it. So they say that there's no need to have separate salt shakers. You can use those for both meat and milk. Where there are children in a household, maybe it's a good idea to have two separate salt shakers because kids tend to stick the salt shaker in the food, and it would the concern we're talking about before would apply. Even when small children are present, if you use a fleshig salt shaker for dairy food or vice versa, you're still allowed to eat the food, even though better to try to remove some of the salt from the food. Some are particular in any case, got to have two separate salt shakers. There you have it. The Chachamim, the sages, prohibited the consumption of many foods cooked by somebody not Jewish. Several exceptions to this rule. First, if the cooked food would not be served at a king's table, ola al shulchan shel malachim, then it's permitted. Second, if the food is edible raw, it's also permitted. A whole lot of conversation we can have about this. We'll have another time, maybe not now. But if a raw food can be rendered edible by eating a little salt, this application of this prohibition of bishul akum applies to that food. If some added salt would make it fit for a king's table, then it does, in fact, fall under the category of bishul akum, something that we should make sure that's prepared by Jews. Salt does not require bishul Yisrael. It doesn't require it to be prepared by Jews since it's edible as it is raw. The only salt that requires a hechsher, kosher supervision during the whole year, except for Pesach, is seasoned salt. So if you use regular old salt, I think most of them have kosher supervision in any case. But if you're buying seasoned salt, it should have kosher supervision because maybe with some of the flavors there's some non-kosher mixture into that flavoring. People are careful to buy all their salt for Pesach with a hechsher. There were instances in history, says Rabbi Belsky, that where flour mills were used to grind salt on Pesach. You can imagine you have these powerful mill apparatuses set up, so they wanted to grind salt, so they just used the flour mill. So that would certainly be a problem on Pesach. Nowadays, I don't believe it's so. However, on Pesach, we should only use non-iodized salt. So if you'll see the salt in the kosher section in the grocery stores, usually it's kosher LePesach salt. That's what they bring into Canada. And it says kosher LePesach because it's non-iodized. What's the story with iodine? Iodine is kosher LePesach, so that's not the problem. But iodine tends to degrade when it gets moist, so a small amount of dextrose is added to the salt to protect the iodine from oxidization. It's a very complicated chemical thing, pretty much beyond what I learned in 10th grade chemistry. Dextrose usually is derived from cornstarch, so it's kitnius, so since that's part of the salt mixture, we don't want to have that consumed on Pesach or mixed into our food. It's also derived from wheat starch sometimes, and therefore it's an actual isser. It's actual prohibition of chametz on Pesach. So in either case, we want to avoid it, so we simply, for that 1 week, we use non-iodized salt, and then after Pesach, go right back to eating the iodized. Okay, one last thing he mentions about buying a house. When entering a newly purchased home, some people have the custom to bring in vinegar and salt, says Sefer Habayis, apparently a sefer that details these customs. Others bring in bread, salt, candles, and honey. And Rabbi Belsky, whom he's quite fond of quoting, as you see, says the custom is one should bring in candles, sugar, salt, and matzah. So there you have it. Okay, that's what he says about salt in halacha. So we'll leave it there for today. Please join us again tomorrow. We'll continue our discussion of halachically speaking, hard to find halachas for everyday living. Have a good day.